I think it's safe to assume that most people like historic buildings. Historic buildings give us a sense of community. They tell a story. Often you can find architecture that is just not done in today's modern buildings. There are many preservation plans put out. There are reams of regulations saying that the government likes historic buildings, the state likes historic buildings. We need to encourage developers to respect the historic landscape. And yet in the end, it seems like this really is no country for old buildings. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, this is the Beverly Depot area and its historic landscape. And these little greenhouses, they represent historic buildings. And these red hotels, they represent new development. Would you know what's historic just by looking at it? Sometimes historic buildings are very obvious. Sometimes you need to take a closer look. A few years ago, the Essex National Heritage Commission did a reconnaissance survey of this whole area, looking for what buildings are historic. When they came down to the Beverly Depot area, they looked at buildings connected with transportation. Now naturally, the Beverly Depot over here would be added to that list. But people missed the two railway hotels standing behind me. Now if you have a railway depot, why wouldn't you put two railway hotels on the same list too? Because often it's rail history that gets overlooked. You really have to be an expert in rail history to understand how important and historically significant some of these buildings are. And I'm going to meet with someone who really knows his rail history, local historian Richard Symmes.
Hey Matt,
How you doing?
how's it going?
Pleasure to have you here.
Yep, good to see you.
Good to see you. So does it surprise you that when the National Essex Heritage Commission studied this area and was looking at all the buildings connected with transportation, they got the railroad depot, but they left out the railroad hotels? Is that a surprise to you as a rail historian?
Not really, Matt, because the hotels themselves don't really look like they have anything to do with the railroad. I mean, the depot obviously has something to do with the railroad, and back in the day you had the water tank and you had the turntable and all that sort of thing. But a hotel is a hotel. It doesn't seem to relate to trains, except you realize it's right across from the depot. And this is where all the salesmen and other visitors to town got off the train, walked across the street, and here was this first-class luxury hotel right there.
Did I just hear Richard right? First-class luxury hotel? Now, I've only known these buildings as one, an Italian restaurant, and two, the infamous press box bar room and the 1886 rooming house. But I have to admit, despite the stories of someone throwing a dead raccoon on a pool table, the building that was the press box intrigued me, just in its design, and it made me want to know more. There's something about that building that didn't quite make sense. I often wondered, why does the side of the building look like the front of the building?
Well, you look at the building today, and of course it's nothing but an old derelict rooming house. But as I said before, this once was a first-class hotel with meals on the European and American plan, with bath on every floor. And the front of the building, the ornate side, faced the track, so that's what the visitors saw when they got off the train. And just had to walk across the street, go into the lobby, and register.
So this is the true front end of the building, even though now all you see is basically a fire door and the front end of the building has become the side of the building. But this is how passengers would have seen this building getting off the train. This building actually was designed to shun the automobile traffic and to appeal more towards the rail passengers. One of the very few buildings that I know of that's focused solely on attracting rail passengers and not so much built for the streetscapes with the automobiles.
Well, right up at the peak, in the center of the building, was the name of the establishment, the Hotel Trafton, and ornate shingles were beneath that, and under that was the date 1886. And as you came down, you had the bay window, which is still there, and below that on the first and second floors, you had a porch that went all the way around the front and the side of the building. very ornate porch at that, with ornate balusters and just very decorative.
And if you look carefully, there are some original details left on this building, but you got to know where to look. You can see that original window treatment with the different lights surrounding the window. Now you can see the original bay window is still there. You even have these decorative brackets that still remain. So we have the first piece in our puzzle. The Hotel Trafton. So by the 1920s, the Hotel Trafton became the Hotel Bond. And in pictures of the time, that's where you really see some of the decorative ornamentation start to go by the wayside. The wonderfully shingled roof was replaced with a tar paper roof. But many of the decorative elements would still remain for years to come. And you could say that it still performed the function of a railway hotel. You know, for the past 126 years, that building has been used continuously for lodging. So on this spot originally, you would have had a house and an L-shaped store. But when Darling Trafton wanted to build his railway hotel here, he had to demolish the L-shaped store. But the actual house still remains. So this portion of the building dates back to before 1883. So not only does this railway hotel really symbolize one era of history, the golden age of railroading, because that original house is there connected to the building, it represents two periods in Beverly's history. So in a way, it was the railroads that created buildings like this, much like the Grand Resort hotels up in New Hampshire. And much like the Grand Resort hotels, they fell into extreme conditions of disrepair, and many of them were demolished. Wherever you had a depot, you seem to have one of these railway hotels in large cities, small cities. Now they're almost nowhere.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Matt. This is in microcosm what you saw in New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine, the grand wooden resort hotels, which were often right nearby the railroad stations, and people came and stayed for a month. And they brought their steamer trunks and they brought their families, and they just stayed there. This was before highways and automobiles and motels pretty much put that era to an end.
And with the automobile came less of a reliance on the railroad, so a lot of these buildings did fall by the wayside. So that's why it's rather interesting that here in Beverly we still have these two examples of railway hotels right next to a depot. The second piece in the puzzle is the Hotel Walter. While not as ornate as the former Hotel Trafton, the Hotel Walter is important. It's a key part of the Beverly Depot's historic landscape. And at some point, the Hotel Walter was bought and turned into the Park Hotel. And then a little later, it became a restaurant, and you know it now as the Casa de Luca Italian Restaurant. So what's the story on this other railway hotel?
This one, as you can see, is today a restaurant. It's been here for quite a while, and they've done a wonderful job rehabbing it, as you can see. And it's not as ornate as the Trafton was in its day, but still it's an example of a railway hotel that has not been demolished, that has been restored and is serving a useful purpose today in the community. And I think that's what we should be aiming for with the Trafton.
So again, this railway hotel is older than the railway depot by about 2 years, 1894, as opposed to 1896, the depot down there. And while this building has been changed over the years, many of the changes reflect, in the spirit of the style of architecture. But there are still some elements of this building that are original. And quite frankly, I think it looks attractive, although it's not as ornate of a design as the Hotel Trafton. The post office. So then really, the new kid on the block is the post office, if you're talking about when these buildings were laid down. When President Taft came here in 1912, this is the only time he ever used the Beverly Depot to get to his summer house. This building was just days away from being opened. And we suspect it was located here because of the location of the railroad depot.
Back in the day, trains carried most of the mail. They were the fastest way, obviously, of transporting mail. They had railway post office cars, which was a separate car, which had just nothing but storage compartments for mail, and they also had a post office right on board the car where clerks actually sorted the mail, and you could even mail a letter by sticking it through a slot in the side of the car when a train was stopped at the depot.
45 Broadway. Of course, all along Broadway, you have these big Victorian mansions like that. That's 45 Broadway in the background. And if you look at some of the styles, and check out the roof line, and some of this fine detail work, and then you compare that to the former Hotel Trafton, I would say that this building was really the inspiration for the design of the Hotel Trafton. So in a way, these buildings are interconnected with each other.
The movers and shakers of Beverly back in the late 1800s lived primarily on Broadway in these great mansions, and it's because of the proximity to the railroad depot. And this house across the street behind Bora's storefront is a perfect example of that sort of thing.
So when you have all these buildings that sort of have a shared history, what do you have? You have the makings of a potential historic district, because all these buildings are interconnected. And separately, they may not be as important, but when you put all the puzzle pieces together, they paint a broader picture of Beverly's history. And without one, the giant picture is greatly diminished. The Massachusetts Historical Commission ruled that the Beverly Depot area itself was eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, and included in that opinion were the two railway hotels. Because it's not just about the preservation of one building, it's about the preservation of an entire vista. You can find an article on the National Trust's website, Smart Growth, New Opportunities for Main Street. This is put out by Doug Loescher, and he writes on historic preservation, "Thankfully, most new urbanists recognize the role of preservation in retaining and enhancing a community's distinct identity, an essential goal of those efforts. Here, preservation means more than old buildings. It also means retaining traditional street patterns, vistas, and landscapes." So you have this nice historic depot with the slanted roof there. But then as you go along, you just see this straight line of high-rises. And then the two railway hotels sort of round things out and give the area context. So some people have said that the former Hotel Trafton is too far gone to be considered historically significant. It's covered in modern siding and has lost many of its ornamental features. But that's not necessarily the case. One website talks about, how to determine historic integrity of a building, and they state that if the building is covered in modern siding but still retains its original fabric underneath, then it's still historic. And then there's the thing that many historians and many preservationists seem to ignore: rarity. If you have one of the last examples of a certain kind of building, then rarity allows for some wiggle room in determining whether the building still has historic significance and integrity. Now, I've done a lot of research, and on the North Shore, you cannot find another large city with a railway hotel right next to a historic railway depot. I think what we have here in Beverly is very special, and it's got to be one of the last examples of this type of building arrangement. Isn't that worth preserving? What if I told you that the only thing preventing the former Hotel Trafton, aka the Press Box, from being a beautiful building right now was a disagreement? A few years ago, Caritas Communities had looked to buy the building, and they were going to partner with North Shore Veterans Counseling Services, which was headed by, I believe, Victor Capozzi. And we read in the newspaper how this building was going to be fixed up. It would take some time. They needed to seek grants, but the whole building was going to be fixed up, and in the end it would look beautiful, in keeping with the spirit of what you see with the Casa de Luca building. Then all of a sudden, we didn't hear anything about Caritas Communities anymore. And then it was just Victor Capozzi's group running the show, doing basically a volunteer effort to try and fix this building up. Well, I reached out to the executive director of Caritas Communities. I want to ask him what the heck happened.
Basically, we had an agreement with Victor's group, and we expected to move forward with them in partnership. And we ended up not doing that. We had a bit of disagreement with Victor's group, or vice versa. I mean, the parties couldn't come to a final agreement about how the partnership would work. So we withdrew from the relationship and basically said to Victor, the purchase agreement that we signed is given to your group. Now go forward and God love you. I think the simplest way to put it is that we and the Veterans Group were not in agreement about the most efficient manner to finance the work, scope of the work, and who would be in charge of determining how the work got done and who would do it. It was a pretty fundamental difference of opinion.
So now developers want to destroy the picture of this historic landscape by removing a very important piece of the puzzle and replacing it with modern construction. Is that appropriate growth? Can you say that that picture that those historic buildings made up will ever be the same? Now, when 45 Broadway was first issued a demolition delay ordinance, I contacted Jen Wallace from Beverly Main Streets and asked, what will our downtown look like if we start to lose historic buildings like 45 Broadway? And her response, thank you for your note. We do focus on historic preservation opportunities, but to be honest, we felt that this particular building had a marginal historic significance. Marginal historic significance. This from a group that always says we are affiliated with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Are you a volunteer at Beverly Main Streets? Are you a member of Beverly Main Streets? Do you agree with that opinion that 45 Broadway is marginally historic? A lot of people certainly don't think so. And now that the building is being used to destroy another historic building, all of a sudden 45 Broadway becomes important again. For 8 months, 45 Broadway sat there empty, counting down the demolition delay ordinance. And not one mover and shaker in the city of Beverly decided maybe we ought to do something, maybe we ought to convene a meeting and figure out a way of preserving that. What does that say about who we are as a community? And also, what does that say about the people making the decisions about what's historic and what isn't? So it's almost like a shell game. The residents of this building move over here. That way, Windover can knock it down. It's not really preservation. It's using one historic building really for the sole purpose of destroying another. So is the former Hotel Trafton too economically unfeasible to restore? Well, to answer that question, all you have to do is go to the next town over, Salem, Massachusetts, and see how they've done some things. So over here we have what's known as the Salem News Building. And I think it's a good example of what can be done when you have new development right next to a historic building that's fixed up. Of course, this building behind me in Salem, the former Elks Club, has been converted to condominiums. Now it's called Eaton Place. Perhaps stands out as one of the best examples of what's possible when you just have a little bit of preservation in mind and the will to do something. The building had actually fallen into disrepair. It was only 2 stories high. Like I said, it was an Elks Club. So you didn't have any kitchens or any places to live. And the developer added an entire 3rd story, in keeping with the original look of the building back in the day, before the 3rd story was actually taken down. And today, it's high-end condominiums. Why can't we do that here in Beverly? My aunt was actually a member of the Elks Club, and I remember going in that building when I was a little kid, when it only had the 2 stories and was falling apart a little bit. There was a pool hall up on the 2nd story, there was a bar room on the 1st floor, so not really an ideal place for condominiums, and yet they figured out a way to convert that building, which was falling apart, into an architectural gem. And that roof you're looking at, completely fabricated just a few years ago. The former Hotel Trafton needs a new roof, but with this project they actually built a new roof and a 3rd story. So if you have a large mansion that's been sitting in the woods for about 30 years, with water leaking in the roofs, no maintenance at all put into the building, trees growing everywhere around it, it's under constant shade, would you say this building can be fixed? Well, that was the case with 18 Felt Street. It was a building I was always fascinated with. We called it the Addams Family House because it was buried so deep in overgrown trees. But eventually a developer got a hold of it and said he was going to knock it down. But people in the community were very upset and said, no, we want this thing fixed. We want this thing restored. We should all work together and find a way to restore it. And in the long run, the building was saved. It was restored. And I think the community, again, is better off for it. Would you say a building that's been sitting empty for nearly 20 years, that had its interior burned by vandals, is beyond repair, is economically unfeasible to restore? Then we need to look at the Salem Jail. The entire Salem Jail project is a good example of what's possible when you work to preserve something. In 1999, a fire broke out inside after being long abandoned for almost 20 years. And yet, somehow, a way was found to find the funding to restore this building back to its original glory. And this property sat derelict year after year after year. At any point, someone could have said, let's tear it down. It's too far gone. The jailkeeper's house, like I said, had caught on fire back in 1999. But there was enough will to say, let's save this. Let's do it right, because in the long run, the results will be overwhelmingly wonderful. But to see what's possible with historic buildings that have been ravaged by fire, we don't need to go to Salem. We can come right back to Beverly and take a look at the old Briscoe School. Several years ago, there was a raging fire inside this building, caused when a couple of homeless people were burning a barrel full of debris to get warm, and it really gutted this building out.
And as you can see now, it's a beautiful elderly housing project, and they rebuilt the entire thing from just a brick shell.
Yeah, I just happened to be at Mass at the time and at St. Mary's, and I noticed this little bit of shadow coming from behind the stained glass window. And then someone came into the church and said, if you're parked over by the old Briscoe School, move your car, it's on fire. And we sat and we watched this building go up. We watched every little air conditioner unit pop out of the building and crash to the ground. And in the end, the shell of what was left looked like something you'd see in Berlin during the World War II. So people actually thought we would have to tear it down, not structurally sound. It's only 4 walls. But this shows you what's possible if the will to do something is there. With historic buildings, sometimes you have to make the building fit into the economy and not the other way around. You can't just say, well, it's not economically feasible. You have to have the will to say, we want to save this building, now let's see what works to make this thing fit in with today's economy. Now they obviously figured it out. And yet there's another building in Beverly that burned, and it was just an empty shell. And it sat there for a good number of months as an eyesore, and people were wondering, is this building just going to sit here? Are we going to tear it down now? It's ugly. But the owner of the building says it will be fixed. And here's the same building now, a few years later. So remember the picture of the way that used to look. It was gutted by fire. There was Almost nothing left of it, just a wooden frame. And yet here it is now. Take a look at what's possible if you have the will to do something. So when they try and say, well, a building is too far gone to be saved, just remember this building down the street and think about that statement. So Windover is quoted as saying that the building can't be saved, that it's too far gone. Well, we thought we'd take this question to Mark Winkheller of Caritas Communities, and here's what he had to say. Is there anything about that building that made you think we shouldn't be doing this, that maybe it's too far gone?
No, I didn't think so.
Okay.
From my perspective, it's a project we were interested in. It's a project we thought could work. It's a project that ultimately I fully expected Victor's Group to do it. And as I said, when I was there last, which is several months ago, they had really done a whole lot of work. It certainly seemed to me to be evidence that they were serious about doing something, because they had done a lot of work. I'm actually surprised to learn that the building might be torn down, because I thought that the intent here was for Victor to fix it up and keep working with it.
Another developer in town said, a building is too economically unfeasible to save. I'm thinking about the house from 1715 that sits on the corner of the Johnny Appleseed site. We were told that there's no reason for it existing now. It has outlived its usefulness. It needs to be torn down. And when you look at the building itself, very little was left of it historically. It had modern siding on it. It had replacement windows. The interior, there was nothing left of it really, aside from some beams and some old wood. But yet, the Historic District Commission ruled that it was historically significant. It had a story to tell, and it was significant just by being there. If you move that house, okay, maybe it would just be an old house. But by that structure being there in that spot, it was of historic value. I would think that the same applies to the former Hotel Trafton. And it looks like this house will make it to 300 years old. Really, what it took was the desire to see a building like this saved. They lost about 5 parking lots for Walgreens to keep this building right where it is. And I think that was a good trade. And I think this is something the community is real happy to see preserved. It's part of their history. As is the case with many historic buildings, you often have to take a lot of time to figure out a use for them. But in the end, the effort is worth it. Just look at the Larkin Theater in Beverly. Do any of you know what the Larkin Theater used to be? If you said an X-rated movie theater, you're correct. Back in the day, it was called the Fine Arts. And, a lot of people probably said, we don't need an X-rated movie theater in our community. Now, if you're a developer, would you say, well, I'll tear down that theater and bring in new development, new revitalization? Or would you rather take the long view and say, this can be fixed up. This can be preserved. We can find a use for it. I think everyone in Beverly is glad that some people decided to go with the latter and say, we're going to take our time and do this right. And now we have the Larkin Theater that we enjoy so much today. But even in Beverly, we have an example of what can be possible if you preserve a historic building and have new growth that really fits in with the old architecture. We have this nice Victorian house right here, right next to the dorms of Montserrat College of Art. But there isn't just one historic building next to the dorms. There are 2. This one over here. No need to tear that building down. And it blends in quite well with new development. This could be new development next to the Beverly Depot, with a preserved railway hotel on one end and a preserved railway hotel on another, of 2 different designs. We're a creative community in Beverly. We should be using our imagination to figure out what to do with the Hotel Trafton. Tear it down and build some shops and some apartment buildings? Well, we're going to get that anyway down the street. Why not try and preserve something that's truly unique? Imagine, if you will, that the Hotel Trafton becomes a featured project on the show This Old House. That would put Beverly on the map like nothing else could. On the next exciting edition of Ask This Old Railway Hotel. Imagine how fun that would be, seeing that building on television being restored. All it takes is a little bit of creativity and imagination to figure these things out. This is what we should be doing in Beverly. It's not like we're talking about stopping all growth. We're talking about one building. Out of the 42 properties in the TIF zone, only 6 were really considered historic by nature. And a few years ago, in the Beverly Citizen, Windover had published some artist renditions of some of the developments they were going to do. It included very big buildings just south of the Depot Square condominiums. And then you have the Enterprise rent-a-car site. And there'll probably be more development all up and down this corridor. So it's not like we're saying stop all development. There's plenty of room for new development next to historic buildings. This shouldn't be an either-or situation. Saving one historic building is not going to stop the revitalization plans that Beverly has. It's often said that there are only 2 other communities in Massachusetts that adopted this TIF zone, Easton and Quincy. But when you look at how they did things, preservation took center stage. The project in Easton was really a preservation project alongside new development because the community wanted it. They didn't want a lot of buildings that were deemed historic to go by the wayside. They made a stand. They raised their voice and they advocated for this. We should be doing the same in Beverly, because when you look at Beverly's TIF plan, it harkens back to the days of urban renewal from the 50s and 60s. And historians will tell you, urban renewal was a terrible thing. But I fear we are on that path again because we haven't learned our lessons from the past.
As we've seen so far, the heritage is still partially here of the railroad district, but we're going to look a little deeper and we're going to see what's not here. And that happened very slowly and very subtly, nibble away a little bit at taking this building down, removing that piece of historic material, until finally there's just this left. And if they take it even further, pretty soon there'll be nothing left but the depot itself. Right now we're looking at the current station, and it's of course a restaurant today, but this building was put up around 1896. It replaced a large covered train shed, which was built by the Eastern Railroad, and even that was the second station in Beverly. The first one in 1840 was down at Congress Street, right at the end of the Beverly-Salem Bridge, and that lasted about 10 years or so, and it was just not big enough for what they needed, and Rantoul Street was developing at that point because of the railroad, and so they built a much larger covered station right about where this current station stands today. Well, here we are in Veterans Memorial Park, and this is right across from Beverly Depot and opposite the post office. And in the early wars, Civil War for instance, Spanish-American War, World War I, most of the soldiers left from this point, getting on the train at the depot, and most of them returned to this point, and some did not return alive, unfortunately. And this park is here representing veterans of all America's wars, and the veterans from Beverly who served and the ones who unfortunately died in battle. For many people coming here to this park back in the day from wars or going to wars, relatives might have welcomed them here and stayed in this hotel or the other one. And those days, of course, ended by World War II. Nobody stayed in a hotel here anymore, but the veterans came back here in World War II, and perhaps even to a limited extent, even from the Korean War. So it's very important.
So, in a way, our rail history is also connected to our veterans.
Oh, absolutely. As I say, this park is here, and it's a veterans park for a reason. That's where most of the people that went to war from Beverly, left, and returned to.
So there are some people who say railway history is not that important. But when you look around at the grand scheme of things, railway history has played an important role in Beverly. The Beverly you know now wouldn't exist without the railroads.
Well, we're here on Park Street, right opposite the depot, and if you look down here behind me, you can see one of the old shoe factories is still standing, and there were several of those right along from where it is now to where we are. And on this side of the street behind me, where Bill's Oil is, there were 4 or 5 tracks, and it was called a team yard, and they would leave freight cars here, and people would come and unload the freight cars onto wagons pulled by teams of horses. So these were team tracks. And they were here until well into the 1960s, because I can remember coming down here and seeing cars still parked in here for the few customers that were left.
So it's a fair assessment to say that if the railroad never came to Beverly, you wouldn't have the United Shoe?
Probably, and the whole Rantoul Street area grew up around the railroad when the railroad came here, because before that, the business district was at Cabot Street, and the depot originally was built at the end of the Salem-Beverly Bridge. It was not until 1847 that they decided to build a new station up here, and then gradually all the industry sprang up around this new station location, including the whole Rantoul Street area. All right, we're over on the west side of the tracks here at Beverly Depot, and in the background over here against River Street used to be a great big 50,000-gallon water tank, and that supplied standpipes at either end of the platforms here, one on the far end and one on this end on each side, so that steam locomotives could take on water whenever they needed it here. So again, this big 50,000-gallon water tank is something long gone, but it was part of the railroad footprint right here in Beverly. This spur track, or what remains of it, was known as Pope's Siding, and the Pope Lumber Company was across the street where Moynihan Lumber is now. And back in 1935, the streamlined Flying Yankee was displayed here in Beverly right on this track, as you'll see in some pictures that we have. Right here is the only part of the turntable pit from the Bass River Yard that's still visible from the street. The building was built right on the turntable pit itself, and they tell me you can still see the inside of it if you go in the building.
Come on down here. We actually got permission from Parley Bicycles to take a look at the turntable pit.
Here we can see inside the building, the inside of the turntable pit, just as it was, minus the ring rail and the center pivot, but here it all is after all these years, now the basement of a bicycle factory.
So this whole long stretch where what you're looking at, the red wall, is all curved, it would have fit one giant turntable, correct?
I think it was a 60-foot diameter turntable, yes.
So it would be big enough to fit a large steam locomotive, definitely.
Good-sized steam locomotive, and it was turned by hand. People actually pushed on poles on either end of the turntable and turned locomotives around by hand.
Now, how is that possible that you could turn something that heavy by hand?
It was all balanced. If you got the locomotive balanced precisely on the center point of the turntable, it became very easy to swing it around.
So what's the significance of this raised portion?
There had to be a center point for the turntable to pivot on, and I suspect that that was right here in the center of this square area.
So here you have the bridge, and then you have this section. It extends out, and there's a reason for that.
This was a 4-track bridge abutment, and they never built the 4 tracks. This was a scheme to come across Boston Harbor underground with the railroad from South Station and come out north of what's now North Station and continue up to Beverly, 4 tracks wide, but it was never done. Right here in this corner was where the Dodge grain elevators used to be, and I can well remember that. It was right where this building now sits. This was all railroad land beyond here down Park Street to the team tracks that we looked at earlier. There were lots of farms in Beverly back in those days, and all the grain was basically shipped in here. Then you came down with your horses and wagons and you picked it up and took it back to your farm, or dealers would take it to their grain stores and sell it. Right where this building behind me now stands used to be the Beverly Freight House, and goods were unloaded from freight cars and stored there until somebody would come and pick them up, like Railway Express parcels would also be unloaded there. And the building burned around 1964 and was never replaced. Okay, so it's getting dark here on this January afternoon. So let's wrap this up by saying that one time this was the center of Beverly's commercial district, and now this precious little left, and each year sees even more buildings threatened with removal, and pretty soon there'll be nothing left of what was once the railroad district in Beverly.
I would like to live in a Beverly where thoughtfulness trumps the bottom line, where we do things not because they're easy, but because they're the right thing to do. Again, going back to the Grand Resort hotels, many of them fell into disrepair. Wentworth by the Sea was almost going to be demolished. It was a total mess, but a way was found to fix that building up and give it a good use for today's day and age. I think what I want isn't so far from what a lot of people want. And only recently in the Salem News, did you see this article about Ada Louise Huxtable? The Salem News says that her work that she did on the North Shore, being an advocate for preservation rather than demolition, was really important. So important that the editorial staff decided to write a little article here. Ada Louise Huxtable and the power of the printed word. Well, I'm hoping that the power of video will also carry some weight with it. I hope that if you are moved in any way by anything that you've seen in this documentary, that you'll get up off the couch and actually participate in this process. So what happens now? Well, the developer has pulled the demolition permit, and any building that's considered historic goes to the Historical Commission for review, and that will be on January 31st. There's a public hearing, and they'll be accepting comments from the public in City Hall. So if you feel in any way that this building should be saved, that the historic landscape of the Beverly Depot area is something that we should work hard to preserve, you need to attend this meeting. And you can also keep in touch with the show and keep the conversation going. Go to No Country for Old Buildings on Facebook and check out the show's website. You'll find all kinds of old pictures, interesting articles, facts, even stuff from our Downtown 2020 plan that calls for preservation. So that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank you for joining me. Hope I made an impression on you. Hope you learned something along the way. You know, when you compare historic buildings with today's modern architecture, and just look at the dollar value alone, there really isn't much comparison. However, historic buildings have inside them something that can't be measured in dollars and cents. They have the soul of the community. They tell the story of where we've been and where we're going. And I think that's something that's worth saving. Again, check us out on Facebook. Keep in touch. Let's keep this conversation going. And I hope you tune in again to the next exciting edition of No Country for Old Buildings. A few years ago, the Essex National Heritage Area Commission... Looks like that's going on the blooper reel. Quiet on the set, everyone. Nice, peaceful neighborhood we live in.
That's trash.
So there are some people that might say railway. Blah, blah. So how do you feel about historic preservation? No comment.
Oh, a few nips. I saw the guy that was sitting there.
So it's good to have you here, and what can you tell me about some of these buildings that... Oop, that didn't come out. I'll try it again. So again, this building is from 1894. That's 2 years... Like I said, it's a nice, quiet neighborhood. No trucks here. Go ahead.
He's a clapper.
I think I hit the wrong button.